Then we get to the appraisal section. With the appraisal section, you're going to have two options. You're going to have an option for it's contingent upon the appraisal, which means the home has to value, or non-contingency, which means if it doesn't, then you have to figure out what you're going to do if the appraisal is less than the purchase price. So let's talk about the appraisal contingency for just a second. A lot of times clients think that the appraisal is made known to all parties in the transaction, and it is not. The appraisal is delivered to the buyer. Therefore, the buyer, if they would like to, can share it with their real estate agent, and if there's a need to, share it with the seller's agent. The only time I see that there's a need to share it with a seller's agent is when the appraisal comes in less. But if the appraisal comes in for $50,000 more, you do not have to disclose that to the seller's agent at all. But if you do find yourself in a situation and the appraisal comes in lower, then that opens the table back up for negotiation. It does not automatically mean that the seller has to meet that appraised value. The seller may want to work in the middle. They may want you to bring money out of pocket to come up with an appraisal gap strategy. But the seller does not have to submit to you the purchase price as per the contract or as per the appraiser. Now, here's the other thing. When an appraisal comes in low, a lot of times the first questions are asked, can we do a reconsideration of value? Yes, that's possible. However, you better have all the details of the comps that you're about to provide. Because here's what that looks like. A reconsideration of value, you submit a form and within a certain amount of time, and it has to have additional comps. First of all, you need to vet the comps out. When I say you, I mean the real estate agents that are representing you as the buyer would need to vet the current comps out, see what they agree with, maybe what they disagree with. Is the square footage on point? Is there something in regards to the property you're buying that they feel there's a different value? But they also have to support that value. It can't just be because they feel it should be worth more. I have had a few successful reconsiderations of value, and I have had other reconsiderations of value that didn't work. So let me touch base real quick to all you real estate agents out there that may be tuning in. Be very careful on how you word the appraisal contingent. I did have a scenario. This was an over-asking situation, and the listing agent in the special stipulations stated this, and I could not believe it. So let's say the list price was $275 a few years ago. My client offered $300,000. So therefore, that was the purchase price. So if nothing else would have been said, it would have said that the appraisal is contingent upon the home appraising for $300,000. If it didn't, then my buyer and the seller had to go back to the negotiation table. If it would have come in for $285, then they could have determined what happened. However, the seller's agent wrote in the contract that the home must appraise for a minimum of $275,000. Needless to say, when the appraisal come in, the home appraised for $275,000. So this made it obligated for the seller to sell that home that my buyer offered $300,000 for $275,000 because the agent wrote in special stipulations it had to appraise at a minimum of that. Why did they do that? I have no idea. The seller's agent was upset. They were the ones that wrote it in the contract. Needless to say, my buyer got a $25,000 discount on what she was going to pay. They wanted to look at a reconsideration of value, but there was no supporting evidence that the property could be worth $300,000. So always make sure you understand the strategies. You don't do any overkill, because if you're a listing agent in that situation, she cost her client $25,000. It may have cost her $25,000, but you don't let the contract as it's written leave room to go back to the negotiation table. The next thing is going to be closing expense. Or real quick, back to the appraisal. If it's non-contingent, then you have to be prepared for a plan. If you're going to offer $500,000 for a home and it appraises for $450,000, what is the plan for the gap? Because the appraisal If you waive the appraisal contingency, then you're not going to be able to eliminate or terminate the contract based on that. So while I'm on the topic of appraisals, let's talk about a few different types of appraisals. So when I say typical appraisal as a conventional, that's what most people are going to prefer. And the reason is because the requirements for a conventional appraisal in regards to the condition of the property are not going to be as strenuous as FHA, USDA, and VA. However, the misconception with a conventional appraisal is that any property will go, and that's just not the case. So, with a conventional appraisal, the appraiser is still looking at a few things. Number one, they're looking at any safety issues. Commonly, this is rails on a house. If your front porch or back porch or deck or whatever you have is too high, they're going to require railing on that property. If you have a safety issue, if they find there's exposed electrical, then that's going to be an issue. If they notice that the floors are sagging, or if they notice that there's issues possibly with a cracked foundation, all of those variables go into a safety and health concern. They're also looking at the condition of the property. The condition of the property from an appraiser standpoint is rated on a scale. Once it reaches above a certain grade, then it's considered below average, and the home has to be brought up to average for your conventional loans, which are pertaining to a Fannie or Freddie type mortgage. So just because it's conventional doesn't mean it's going to be good to go. The next appraisals we would talk about is the government appraisals. So let's talk about the FHA and USDA. Both of those operate on the same wavelength. Now, over the years, it's amazing because the guidelines that people have the myth about are not really there. So we took the conventional and we discussed about safety and health. This the same with an FHA, with a few little additional things. One of the biggest things is the flaking paint. FHA is always big, and USDA and even VA. VA has kind of reduced some of their appraisal requirements, but flaking paint, a broken window pane, which that could be considered a safety issue, water releases on your hot water heater, exposed electrical. You would be surprised to know that a lot of properties that I see, for example, I just received one on a home that was built in 1928, and it was recently remodeled. However, a home with 1928, you're going to think it's going to have some issues. It came in as is. So the value of the property came in as is, meaning that the appraiser did not require for it to have additional improvements made to bring up to code. However, don't worry, if a property is done subject to, generally the repairs are minimum. That's why it's called an MPR, minimum property requirement. They're not asking for you to remodel the whole house. They're asking you to take the issues at hand, fix them. The appraiser comes back, they verify they've been done, and it's all good to go. In my lifetime, most of those repairs are going to range between $500 to $1,500. There may be very few times that I've seen one that exceeds that amount. So don't freak out because either one, you're getting an FHA or USDA loan, or two, you're the seller on the other end that's receiving an offer that's an FHA or USDA loan. So then we have the VA loan. VA loan is going to operate very similar. However, it honestly doesn't have the as many conditions as what an FHA or USDA. And recently, they made even more adjustments to lessen the requirements on their minimum property requirements. One of the things is if there is a building on the property that has no value to it, such as a storage building or something like that, then as long as that property has no value, it does not need to meet the minimum property requirements. So I had one a couple of months ago that had an old barn on it out in the field. At first, the appraiser, this is when the guidelines were changing, they wanted this barn to be repainted and rewired and all of this. We pushed back on that. And the appraiser removed any potential value of the barn, and we closed the loan. So you have that. Now, it's important to note when you're doing a loan, if you're pursuing a VA, the VA appraisal is ordered through the VA. We do not order it through an appraisal management company, which most other appraisals are ordered from. We order it directly from the VA. So what does that mean? If you start with a VA and you get a VA appraisal, you can't switch that VA appraisal over to a conventional or over to an FHA loan. If you start with an FHA loan or a USDA loan, and for some reason you're a veteran and you want to go to a VA loan, you can't take that over into a VA loan. It is very specific. Has to be ordered by the VA team, and it's returned to us for the purposes of a VA loan. Now, if you go with a conventional, an FHA, a USDA loan, we order those through an appraisal management company, but we can use that appraisal for a different loan. So we can use a conventional appraisal for an FHA loan. However, if we do change products like that, then we do have to send the appraiser back out to verify the report and to make any corrections that would make it meet FHA standards. Going back from an FHA to a conventional is a bit easier than that. However, if there's subject tos related to health and safety, those things are still going to be fixed. So that's the information that you need to know when it comes to the appraisal portion. And I'll give you one last tip. If you're a good credit client with a lot of money down, there's a potential that you could get what's called a PIW, property inspection waiver. You may not even need an appraisal on the property when you're going to buy that. Hey, do me a favor. If you like this video, make sure to leave me a comment, like, and hit that subscribe button. Also, if you know of someone that's maybe looking to purchase a home or even a refinance, hit the share so they can get all this information for themselves.